Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're turning our attention to Thomas Pynchon's 2013 novel, Bleeding Edge. And specifically, its incredibly profound, complex processing of the September 11th trauma.
Right.
We're going to be grounding our discussion today in Miriam Fernandez-Santiago's fascinating analysis of the novel, which views the text through the lens of Dominic LaCapra's trauma theory. Specifically, his concepts of acting out versus working through.
Yeah, and for those who might not have LaCapra's psychological frameworks totally fresh in their minds, acting out is essentially when a person, or, well, in this case, a whole society, is just trapped by their trauma. You're repeating it compulsively without actually processing it. There's a dissociative lack of emotion. Whereas working through, on the other hand, is when you finally gain enough critical distance to actually mourn, to achieve what LaCapra calls empathic unsettlement.
Exactly. Empathic unsettlement. And the central question we are exploring today is exceptionally clear. In moving from acting out to working through this massive collective trauma of 9/11, does Pynchon fundamentally abandon his signature postmodern ironic detachment in favor of the modernist elegiac tradition,
Or does he utilize those very postmodern, hyper-real virtual spaces to forge a new, evolved framework for post-traumatic mourning?
Right, that's the core of it. And I will argue that Pynchon utilizes the modernist elegiac tradition, specifically drawing on the deep-grounded lament of T.S. Eliot, to morally condemn postmodern detachment and to genuinely work through historical trauma with raw, empathetic human feeling.
And I will argue that the novel processes this trauma by allegorizing it through bleeding edge technology. He's using the virtual space of Deep Archer as the ultimate postmodern mourning site, thereby evolving rather than abandoning his postmodernist roots.
Okay, so to really understand what Pynchon is doing in Bleeding Edge, I think we have to recognize that this novel marks a definitive paradigm shift in his aesthetic trajectory. I mean, before the 9/11 attacks actually occur in the narrative, the characters are entirely trapped in that state of acting out. Pynchon portrays this late 90s postmodern detachment as mechanized, empty, and honestly just morally bankrupt.
It's certainly a bleak portrayal of the dot-com boom era. I'll give you that.
It is. It really is. We see this so vividly in two key pre-91 scenes. First, consider our protagonist, the fraud investigator Maxine Tarnow, and her loveless sudden sexual encounter with the shady government operative Nicholas Windist. It is described with this incredible, almost mechanical coldness. Her body is literally compared to a video game device.
Mm-hmm.
Her nerve receptors are pushed like buttons on a game controller. It's totally dissociated.
And you see a similar dynamic with Vip Epperdu, right?
Precisely. We have the middle-aged fraudster Vip Epperdu's drug-fueled porn shoot with Bruno and Shay. It's an emotionally vacant, compulsive repetition of a script that ends in pure physical exhaustion rather than any genuine human connection. So my premise here is that to achieve working through, which requires true empathic unsettlement, Pynchon realized he had to break free from this postmodern ironic prison. He had to pivot toward the lyrical, modernist elegy, grounding the mourning process in physical, historical reality rather than digital abstraction.
Well, I agree that the transition from acting out to working through is undoubtedly the central movement of the text. Where we diverge is exactly how he gets there. I'd argue Pynchon does not abandon the postmodern framework to achieve this emotional resonance. Rather, he actualizes its fullest potential.
How so? Because the early chapters seem to aggressively condemn that very framework.
They critique its early application, sure, but look at where the profound moments of mourning actually happen later on. The genuine instances of empathic unsettlement do not happen by rejecting technology or metafiction. They occur explicitly within Deep Archer, which is this hyper-real, bleeding-edge virtual reality code hidden within the deep web.
Right, the virtual space.
Yes. Deep Archer functions as an allegory for postmodernism itself. It's a space constructed entirely of pixels and avatars that paradoxically provides the necessary critical distance to process the overwhelming, incomprehensible trauma of 9/11. The working through is achieved precisely because it is mediated through the very technological, fragmented tools Pynchon has utilized throughout his whole career. He's showing us that postmodernity actually has the internal capacity to mourn.
Let's look closely at how Pynchon constructs the period just before the attacks, though, to see why I believe a departure from those postmodern aesthetics is absolutely necessary. I want to focus on the 1999.com bubble party at the Italian Palazzo in Chapter 28. This scene is a masterclass in using dramatic irony to condemn a society's emotional dissociation. Pynchon highlights the absolute financial and scatological obscenity of the era. He guides Maxine through this ascending succession of toilets.
Ah, yes, the infamous toilet matrices.
Right. We see unisex, privacy-free toilets where businessmen are just urinating against stainless steel walls, and ultimately it culminates in a distressed and toxic single toilet bowl that people are actually queuing up for in this dim, club-like atmosphere. It's grotesque. And all inside this, guests are wearing Y2K I Survive t-shirts. Maxine explicitly notes the overwhelming verticality of this space, the stairwells, the atria, the shadows plunging from overhead in repeated assaults. I argue that this isn't just typical Pynchonian zaniness for the sake of a laugh. He is using this dramatic irony to condemn these characters as complicit perpetrators of their own destruction. Their mindless, emotionless partying acts as a surrogate for the excessive, ungrounded financial capitalism that set the stage for literal and figurative collapse.
I hear what you're saying about the dot-com party, but I come at it from a different way. That pre-climactic irony isn't a mere moralistic condemnation. It is a vital, necessary postmodern device. By framing the financial excess of the late 90s through the scandalogical, light sub-vaudevillian tone, Pynchon is deliberately building an anticipatory anxiety in the reader.
Anticipatory anxiety.
Exactly. We, as readers in 2013 or today, know exactly what is coming in Chapter 29, The Towers Fall. But the characters in their little Y2K shirts do not. When the narrator asks who among them can see ahead to the shape of the day imminent, the reader is forced to self-reflectively engage with their only complicity in this carnivalesque excess. It is not about drawing a clear-cut modernist moral distinction between victim and perpetrator. Remember, LaCapra's concept of empathic unsettlement specifically precludes full identification with either victims or perpetrators. It requires a nuanced middle ground. By making the party so grotesque yet so familiar, Pynchon is setting the stage for empathic unsettlement. The irony doesn't cause the trauma. It forces the reader into a self-reflective stance that is required to truly work through the subsequent historical loss.
That's an interesting point, though I would definitely frame it differently. The anticipatory anxiety you mentioned exists, certainly, but consider what happens when that anxiety actually breaks, when the towers fall. After the attacks, Maxine's friend Heidi explicitly tells her that it is as if somehow irony actually brought on the events of September 11. That is a devastating indictment of the very aesthetic posture you are defending.
But is Heidi acting as the definitive voice of the novel there? Or just a traumatized character trying to make sense of senseless?
I think she's articulating the novel's core shift. Look at the structural metaphor. The verticality of that palazzo party, the celebration of ascending without consequence, the endless upward mobility of the dot-com boom is literally flattened when the Twin Towers collapse. The text is forcing a reckoning. The irony of the 1990s was a form of acting out, a compulsive repetition of financial behaviors detached from material reality. When the historical trauma occurs, the text strips away that irony completely. It leaves Maxine and the reader in a space where, as Heidi says, everything has to be literal now. The transition from the obscenity of the toilet matrices to the raw, physical ash of downtown Manhattan is an aesthetic shift away from postmodern play into a modernist, literal confrontation with death.
But the transition into the literal does not mean the tools of postmodernism are suddenly tossed in the garbage. Pynchon is holding a mirror up to postmodernism, yes, but he is using its own reflection to do so. The idea that irony brought on the events is a literalization of a metaphor, but the novel itself doesn't retreat into straightforward 19th century realism. It pivots into the hyperreal. The anxiety built in Chapter 28 acts as a launch pad into the virtual mourning of the later chapters.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the novel's most authentic, transformative moments of mourning are entirely physical and historically grounded. They are completely divorced from the hyperreal. Let's trace the trajectory of Maxine's grief for Windust. Where does she actually confront the reality of his loss? It is not in a digital space. In Chapter 37, she discovers Windust's actual physical corpse.
In the apocalyptic safe house.
Yes, the very place they previously engaged in that mechanized, detached video game-like sex. But now, the detachment is gone. She is rescuing his body from a herd of wild dogs that are actively feeding on it. The apartment walls are described in colors of medical waste. It's brutal. She is physically repulsed. She literally vomits from the raw, unmediated emotion of the discovery. This is a visceral, biological reaction to death. There is no ironic distance here. And later, how does she achieve true closure?
You're going to bring up the walk to ground zero.
I have to. She takes a physical walk to ground zero with Windust's ex-wife, Xiomara. Maxine explicitly states she had been avoiding ground zero since the attacks. Walking there, smelling the demolition and the smoke, is the moment she truly confronts the historical trauma. She escapes the virtual realm to find empathic unsettlement in the dirt, the ash, and the physical geography of New York City. You simply can't code that.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered how profoundly the virtual space mediates and facilitates that very physical mourning? You mentioned Windust, but Maxine's primary, most poignant search for him happens explicitly in Deep Archer. She goes into the code looking for him, fully aware that Deep Archer, as the text explicitly notes, doesn't do resurrections. She isn't looking for magic. She is seeking a space for ritual mourning. She's undertaking a catabasis.
A catabasis?
Yes, the classic epic descent into the underworld. But here, the underworld is entirely digital. It's a descent into the deep web. Furthermore, look at how the novel resolves the earlier detached sex shoot with Vip Epperdu. Where does Maxine find the emotional truth of that triad? It's not in the physical world. She finds Vip's avatar standing alone on a ridgeline in Deep Archer, gazing at a virtual desert, mourning the loss of his threesome, with pure, undistilled feeling. The text describes Deep Archer as a sacred city all in pixels waiting to be reassembled. It is the definitive site where the past is ethically re-encountered. Pynchon is showing us that the posthuman virtual landscape isn't a distraction from physical grief. It is the modern mechanism for it. Just like how people today might visit a deceased loved one's social media page to process their grief, Pynchon's characters use Deep Archer. It strips away the social constraints of physical reality and allows for pure empathic connection.
But notice the vocabulary you were forced to use to defend this. Sacred city, underworld, catabasis. You are applying ancient, epic, and deeply modernist mythic frameworks to describe a computer program. I think Pynchon is pointing out the ultimate limitation of Deep Archer. Maxine knows it doesn't do resurrections. The virtual space is, at its core, a void. The loneliness Vip experiences in the virtual desert is just a realization of absence. It is merely an echo of the real loss that happened in physical space. Deep Archer might function as a waiting room, but the actual working through, the physical tears, the vomiting, the walking over the bridge, has to happen in the real world. The virtual space is ultimately insufficient for the gravity of real historical trauma.
I'd argue it is not insufficient. It's allegorical. The fact that Deep Archer cannot physically resurrect the dead is precisely what prevents redemptive foreclosure.
What do you mean by redemptive foreclosure?
It means wrapping up the trauma with a neat, happy bow. If Deep Archer could bring Windus back, that would be acting out. It would be a fantasy of undoing the trauma entirely. By acknowledging its limitations, the virtual space forces empathic unsettlement. Vip's realization of his terrible freedom in the virtual desert transforms his deviant, mechanized sexuality from the earlier chapters into a pure, elegiac feeling of love and loss. It is the virtual mediation that allows the shift from fetishization to true mourning. The pixelated landscape gives them the critical distance required to feel the pain without being destroyed by it.
Well, this brings us directly to the intertextual core of the novel, which I believe firmly establishes my point regarding a shift in aesthetics. The public sphere of the novel's trauma is overtly mapped onto T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and Dante's Inferno. The parallels are inescapable, and they're deliberate. Think about when Maxine and Xiomara are looking at the Brooklyn Bridge. The narrator describes the legion of traumatized souls flowing across it, vacant-eyed and dust-covered. This directly mirrors Eliot's description of the souls flowing over London Bridge in the Brill of the Dead, which itself mirrors Dante's souls in hell.
The imagery is certainly resonant, yes.
It's more than resonant. It's a direct invocation. Furthermore, the alpha dog that Maxine confronts near Windus' corpse is a direct invocation of the dog digging up the corpse in Eliot's garden. Through these deep modernist alignments, Pynchon is suggesting something profound. He's suggesting that postmodernism, with its endless rhizomatic deferral of meaning, where everything is just a reference to another reference and nothing means anything concrete, failed us. It failed to create a collective consciousness capable of preventing the collapse of the Twin Towers, which again perfectly mirrors the ruins tower in Eliot's The Wasteland. Pynchon is signaling a necessary retreat from the empty play of postmodernism to a modernist, non-redemptive aesthetic that finally takes ethical responsibility for historical tragedy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Invoking Eliot and Dante is not a retreat. It is a classic postmodern pastiche deployed for a radical new purpose. Pynchon is not abandoning his aesthetic. He is cannibalizing the modernist canon to rebuild the postmodern project. The text explicitly suggests that the novel works through postmodernism by producing an effect of aesthetic unsettlement. Think back to Deep Archer, our sacred city of pixels. It's described as a place where disasters could be run in reverse, waiting to be reassembled. Pynchon is allegorically reconstructing postmodernism from its own fragmented bits. He is demanding that postmodernity take ethical responsibility in its present and future projects without losing its foundational, existential anguish. The use of Eliot isn't an admission of defeat, it is an integration.
He is proving that a text can be technically postmodern, steeped in metafiction and pastiche, while still holding the profound ethical weight of an elegy.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. If he were merely performing a postmodern pastiche, the emotional register would remain ironic or detached, as it so often does in his earlier works. But the tone shift here is absolute. The intertextuality operates differently than it does in early Pynchon. In those older texts, the references are designed to induce readerly paranoia. They keep you guessing. Here, the references to the wasteland are anchoring mechanisms. They force the reader to stop drifting through the hyperreal and confront the literal ashes. When the narrator speaks of the traumatized souls smelling of demolition, smoke, and death, there is no sub-vaudevillian wing to the audience. There's no joke. It is an unvarnished lament. Pynchon is using the modernist text to supply the gravity that the postmodern 1999.com world entirely lacked. He is implying that the aesthetic detachment of the pre-9/11 era was a form of acting out, an aesthetic prison that left society unequipped to handle true historical trauma.
The emotional register shifts, yes, absolutely. But that shift is exactly what allows postmodernism to evolve rather than die. You mentioned the rhizomatic meaning deferral of his earlier works. Here, he replaces that endless deferral with empathic unsettlement, exactly as LaCapra defines it. The virtual, the intertextual, and the posthuman are no longer used to avoid reality. They are the specific vocabularies through which these characters are able to confront it. Consider the scene where Maxine says goodnight to Windus' spirit after snorting the last vestiges of his punk rock cologne. She is blending the physical artifact, the cologne, with the virtual memory. Pynchon is demonstrating that the fragmented, media-saturated, hyperreal conditions of the 21st century are not inherently incapable of grief. They are simply the new terrain of grief.
As we draw this discussion to a close, I maintain my perspective that Bleeding Edge represents a vital, necessary pivot in Pynchon's career. The novel brilliantly demonstrates how deep historical trauma, specifically the incomprehensible shock of September 11th, requires us to pierce the veil of postmodern irony. By embracing a genuine, modernist elegiac Laurent, and by grounding the process of mourning in the physical reality of corpses, ash, and historical geography, Pynchon argues that we must escape the disassociative loops of acting out to ethically confront the losses of history.
And I stand by the view that the novel proves postmodernity can and does evolve. Rather than retreating to a past aesthetic, Pynchon actualizes the latent potential of his own literary tradition by utilizing virtual posthuman spaces like Deep Archer. And by maintaining a metafictional intertextual distance, the novel fosters a unique, ethically responsible ritual of mourning. It is through the pixels, the avatars, and the code that modern characters manage to process their existential anguish.
Well, I think regardless of which aesthetic framework we prioritize today, there is a profound point of convergence here. We both agree that Pynchon successfully utilizes Dominic LaCapra's concept of empathic unsettlement. By resisting any simplistic redemptive narratives or apocalyptic closures that just wrap everything up neatly, the novel forces the reader to critically engage with the trauma of 9/11 in a state of sustained ethical reflection.
Exactly. The refusal to offer a neat resolution, whether through a magical virtual resurrection in Deep Archer or a tidy moral binary of victim and perpetrator in the real world, is the text's greatest strength. It reflects the immense, layered value of examining how literature and aesthetics are forced to adapt and evolve in the face of truly incomprehensible historical events.
Absolutely. Bleeding Edge offers incredibly intricate, challenging material that absolutely warrants further exploration by anyone interested in the intersections of history, technology, and collective grief. The text refuses easy answers, and so must we. Thank you for joining us for this intellectual exchange, and we leave it to you, the listener, to explore the material and form your own conclusions.